We're recording today, but we are not going to be recording the Q&A portion of the proceedings. I'm Ellen McDonald, and I'm a librarian at the Ginn Library. We're delighted to have you all here. We're going to be hearing from Professor Katrina Burgess, who is the Associate Professor of Political Economy. She's not only an author, I want to say this, she's also a filmmaker. I was not too long ago watching Waylaid in Tijuana, which is on YouTube. You can see it. It's an amazing documentary, very powerful and moving, and gives a sort of concise overview of the plight of migrants that have been shut out of the United States at our southern border. I thought it was fantastic. But today, Professor Burgess is going to be talking about her new book, Courting Migrants, How States Make Diasporas and Diasporas Make States. So this book is based on in-depth research on state-migrant relations in 4 high migration countries: Turkey, the Dominican Republic, the Philippines, and Mexico. So as I said, we're going to hear from Professor Burgess for about a half hour. And if you have questions, if you can just put them into the Q&A. After her remarks, we'll start taking questions. You could also, if you want to ask them live, you could indicate that in the on the Q&A platform. So, all righty, Professor Burgess, thank you. Over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Ellen, and thanks to Ginn Library for hosting my book talk. We were supposed to do it last semester, but for obvious reasons, it got delayed a little bit, but I'm delighted to be able to share this multi-year project with all of you here. Thanks for coming at a busy time on a Friday afternoon. So I am going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint. So hopefully, everyone can see that. So the book is called Courting Migrants, as Ellen said, How States Make Diasporas and How Diasporas Make States. And it was published in August of last year. And as I said, it was a multi-year project. It took me a long time to have it all come together. It was a very ambitious project, but a really fascinating and rewarding one as well. And the way I thought I would start is actually, I'm going to very briefly read from the book, because I start the book with 2 anecdotes, which I think set up my research question really nicely. So I'm just going to read just a couple of paragraphs from the very beginning of the book. In April 2010, a group of Mexican migrants traveled from Chicago to Mexico City to lobby federal legislators for more effective outreach to Mexicans living in the United States. Most of them led US-based hometown associations, or HTAs, that had invested significant resources in improving their communities of origin. Several had also served on an advisory council created within Mexico's foreign ministry to elicit proposals on migrant affairs. Yet they were received with either disinterest or outright resistance by the legislators, a stance they attributed in part to the dismal turnout by migrant voters in Mexico's hotly contested 2006 elections. Despite the importance of migrant remittances to Mexico's foreign reserves and the country's recent transition to democracy, these migrants lacked leverage with party leaders because neither voters nor parties were heavily invested in transnational politics. Low turnout persisted in the 2012 elections, with fewer than 50,000 migrants casting ballots from abroad, and the Mexican government suspended the Migrant Advisory Council in 2014. Meanwhile, a very different story was unfolding on the other side of the Atlantic, where Turkey's Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan was holding massive rallies in Europe as he campaigned for president in Turkey's 2014 elections, which also happened to be the first elections with voting from abroad. Rather than losing interest when turnout proved disappointing, Turkish politicians doubled their efforts to mobilize extraterritorial voters for parliamentary elections in 2015. In the process, they unleashed a cycle of growing turnout, fueled by heightened campaigning that nearly caused a diplomatic crisis. Facing its own elections, the Dutch government refused to let 2 Turkish ministers enter the country in March 2017 to attend mass rallies in support of a pro-regime referendum in Turkey, scheduled for July. In response, hundreds of Turkish nationals gathered outside their consulate in Rotterdam to protest the Dutch government's decision. As Dutch riot police dispatched metal barriers and water cannons to contain the protesters, officials from the 2 countries unleashed a war of words that threatened to derail Dutch-Turkish diplomatic relations. The confrontation appears to have helped leaders in both countries. The Dutch incumbent survived an electoral challenge from the anti-immigrant right, and the Turkish referendum won with 51.6% of the vote, including nearly 800,000 yes votes from abroad, or about 3% of the total. So the reason I start the book, and I'm starting this presentation with these 2 anecdotes, is that they pose a couple of questions. And the main question, specific to these anecdotes, is why did Mexican and Turkish authorities respond to political outreach and mobilization by their immigrants abroad so differently? Why were the Mexican authorities basically either disinterested or resistant, where the Turkish authorities sought to further mobilize and capture electoral support from Turkish nationals living outside the borders of their homeland? And then a corollary question is, how have these different responses by homeland authorities shaped the ways in which migrants engage in politics back home, as well as the degree to which they engage? And so this is the motivating question behind this book project, is to understand these variations in relationships between states and their citizens living abroad or residing abroad. And my argument is that this is part of a process of what I call, and I didn't make this term up, I borrowed it from elsewhere, but I call diaspora making, right? So my argument is that migrant political engagement in the politics of their country of origin is shaped by diaspora making projects of homeland authorities. And by homeland authorities, I mostly mean governments or states, but I also include that in that party leaders, political parties, particularly governing parties, but also to some degree opposition parties. So before I go on to develop this argument, let me talk a little bit about this term diaspora. So traditionally, diaspora, the definition of a diaspora was groups forced to flee persecution who maintain a strong collective identity across time and space. And some of the sort of classic examples of this sort of diaspora would be the Jewish diaspora, the Armenian diaspora. I mean, there are a few other that are sort of traditionally considered to be diasporas under this definition. In the last 20, 30 years, the definition has been stretched, I would suggest, beyond recognition to essentially include anyone outside their country of origin. So people use migrants and diasporas, refugees and diasporas pretty much interchangeably. I want to suggest, along with some other scholars, that there's an intermediate understanding and definition of diasporas, which retains some of its original meaning, but is more flexible and can be applied more broadly to groups outside their homeland. And this I follow this Babak, who argues that diasporas are created through discourses, and I would add practices, about transnational belonging to a political community. Diaspora is, migrants become a diaspora through discourses and or practices of incorporation into their homeland. And this can happen bottom up. So sometimes migrants themselves, they construct themselves as a diaspora by demanding membership in their homeland, or it can happen top down, whereby states or parties try to incorporate migrants into their particular political projects. And so my book is about this sort of interaction between states constructing their migrants as diasporas for various purposes, and then those migrants constructed as diasporas responding as such, or resisting it, or demanding some sort of counter agenda and counter project, and unpacking that in a set of different concrete empirical cases. And so it is in this respect that my book is essentially looking at how states make diasporas through this incorporation project, and in turn, diasporas make states. I'm going to spend most of this talk on the first part of that equation, but just to kind of signal some of the ways in which diasporas make states. And I have a chapter that's completely devoted to this process. And that is, first of all, through the institutional adaptations that states undertake to reach out to their diasporas, in turn kind of transforms the state. Creating extraterritorial voting rights, for example, that changes the definition, the meaning of inclusion, of citizenship, et cetera. And in that, in turn, transforms the state itself. And then the other way diasporas make states is if they push back, and particularly if they succeed in pushing back on states' sort of self-definition and self-construction. So I look at that in one of the chapters of the book, but I'm not going to talk about that so much today. So now let me turn to the question of why do states make diasporas, right? Why are they interested in what folks who've left the country, are not residing on the national territory, why do they care about them? And I argue that states have three broad reasons for wanting to incorporate migrants, construct them as diasporas, and engage them in their projects as state authorities or party leaders. One is to attract economic resources. And this is sort of the most well-known and obvious, right? Remittances have gotten a lot of attention in recent years. Governments have created all sorts of programs and policies and even institutions to leverage, attract and leverage remittances that migrants send back to their country of origin. And migrants usually send them directly to their friends or family in their community, but states are interested in either leveraging those remittances. Those remittances go into their foreign reserves, which can be helpful for their macroeconomic policy, et cetera. So many migrant sending states are very interested in attracting remittances. And so they need to convince migrants that it's worth their while to invest through remittances in their country of origin. States also are often interested in attracting investment, right? Overseas investment by their citizens or descendants of citizens abroad. And in some cases, this investment has had a huge impact. I mean, China and India are the most well-known cases of this. But again, countries have come up with policies and programs and institutions to try to attract investment by their diasporas. Another objective that states sometimes pursue when they're, and thereby sort of making diasporas, is they're trying to convert their nationals abroad into a foreign policy lobby. In other words, to mobilize those abroad or encourage those abroad to put pressure on the government of the country in which they're living to change its foreign policy in such a way that is favorable to their country of origin. And a sort of paradigmatic example of this is in the United States is the Jewish lobby, right? Which has been very effective in shaping US policy toward Israel. That's probably the most common example. But there are lots of governments that sort of play this game of mobilizing their migrants abroad to act as a foreign policy lobby in the country in which they're residing. It usually requires that those migrants have citizenship rights in that country. So it's not generally inclusive of all migrants abroad, but rather a relatively empowered subset of those migrants who have status, both legal and economic. And then the third objective that states pursue when they're trying to make diasporas is, and I think this is increasingly true if you kind of look across the world, is as a source of electoral support, right? So increasingly, leaders and their parties are going abroad for votes, for financial support, campaign financing, and to some degree, they're trying to trigger an indirect mechanism of support whereby if those abroad approve of what they're doing, they talk to their family members and maybe change their vote. Or directly, as more and more countries provide the right to vote from abroad to their citizens living outside the borders of the territory. And so they're directly competing for votes within that electoral consistency. So that's another sort of the third type of objective that states may have of incorporating those living abroad into the national project. What I find in my research is that this varies a lot from one country to another, or from one state to another. And part of my argument is that the nature of the state's objectives, and thereby the nature of its diaspora making project, has a big influence on the ways in which migrants then engage in politics in their homeland. Before I get to that, one more sort of conceptualization, and this will take a little bit more explaining. So the second question is, how do states make diasporas? Or how do they attempt to make diasporas, to incorporate migrants into their projects effectively from their point of view? And I start out with this argument about how can states exercise authority or gain cooperation when those from whom they're trying to gain cooperation live outside their jurisdiction, right? They don't have as many instruments of power or influence, right? Vis-a-vis people who are outside the borders of the state. So so they lack as much coercive power. There are states who've gone outside their borders to coerce oppositional diasporas, for sure, but it's much more of a stretch. They don't have the full range of tools to get cooperation. And so they rely much more heavily on loyalty, on cultivating the loyalties of those who are living abroad, so that they participate in and collaborate with the agendas of those who are in power or striving to be in power, right? So loyalty is a really critical concept in my book. And then what I really want to look at is, how do states go about cultivating these loyalties? And in turn, how does the way they do that affect, again, the way migrants engage in politics back home? And I break this down, as this chart shows, along two dimensions. One is the dimension of the type of loyalty that they're trying to cultivate. And I argue that there are two kinds of loyalty. There's an effective loyalty, which is much more based on sort of emotion and identity and sort of a sense of belonging. And there's some leaders who really try to cultivate this type of loyalty. Either it's through nationalism, or it could be sort of ethnic identification, or shared, past of persecution, or whatever the case may be. There's an appeal to emotions and sentiment to bind those living abroad to the national project, or the project of these particular leaders. And then the other kind of loyalty is a strategic loyalty, which is basically iterated exchanges that create relationships of trust and support over time. But it's more contingent, right? Because if it's a strategic type of loyalty, if the one who's cultivating it stops providing the goods, it'll eventually wither away. So it's a more contingent loyalty, and it's based on some exchange of something, right? And then the other dimension that I look at is, are these leaders reaching out to a broad, diffuse group of migrants abroad? Are they sort of constructing a kind of broad diaspora? Or are they more selective and focusing on a narrow subset of a potential diaspora? And then using those two dimensions, I come up with 4 types of loyalty cultivation. And this will make more sense when I talk a little bit about the cases. And the 4 types of loyalty cultivation are exclusionary nationalism, where the main appeal is you are part of a particular national project that doesn't include these other people, including some folks in the diaspora. But it can really mobilize groups, because they don't want the other group to get in power at home, never mind, sort of have a shifting balance of power abroad. So that's one kind of loyalty appeal. Another that is more effective is an inclusionary nationalism. Like, we're all, you're part of the Mexican nation. We're all Mexicans. And I know you're patriotic, and therefore you're going to send your money back home. So that's a more inclusionary appeal. And then on the strategic side, There can be very targeted, I call them side payments, to kind of construct this strategic loyalty and support, which would be very specific benefits that are provided to members of the diaspora. Seats or access to particular funds or programs, that sort of thing. Or there can be very diffuse side payments, which are broad kind of benefits that are open to a larger cross-section of a country's citizens living abroad. And what I find is that the type of loyalty cultivation is very, matches up quite nicely with the ways in which migrants engage with politics back home, which I'll explain in a second. Hopefully I'm not going to go too much over time. So let me, before I get into the cases, just one more abstract slide kind of laying out my argument. So I've been talking about state diaspora making and migrant engagement, and I see this as an interactive sort of feedback loop. That the ways in which the state reaches out shapes how migrants engage, and then that in turn shapes the way sort of the calculations that leaders make about the best way to win cooperation or support from abroad. But I think that's not the whole story, right? And so I bring in two other broad sets of variables, if you will, and kind of construct this set of feedback loops. And this is what I'm going to talk about in the specific cases in a second, between not just state diaspora making strategies and migrant engagement, but also the degree to which political parties have become transnationalized on the one hand, and then migrant profiles on the other hand. And if you look at the arrows, the only one of these four that has arrows pointing only in one direction is migrant profiles. So migrant profiles are the only thing that are at least partially exogenous in this feedback loop. Everything else, it's interactive. What do I mean by migrant profiles? Migrant profiles include socioeconomic status, so things like income level, education level. It includes things like where they go, how densely the density of their residential patterns, right? Is it an ethnic enclave, or are they dispersed throughout the destination country? Why they left, when they left. These are the sorts of things that I include within migrant profiles. And some of these are not affected by these other things going on in my framework, except as hopefully I'll have time to talk about a little bit. In the Philippines case, actually the state's diaspora making strategies helped to construct migrant profiles. But for the most part, that is unidirectional, except for the interaction with migrant engagement and party transnationalism, which feeds back into the nature of the migrant community abroad. All right, so hopefully everyone is still with me. Let me now talk about my cases. So what I did is I came up with a paired comparison, and I chose a set of cases that had some things in common. So just to list a few, one is they're all countries that are considered to be part of the global South. Although, you know, is Turkey European or not, that is debated. But it's been certainly in terms of income level, it's considered to be a part of the global South. They're all countries that experienced a significant amount of mass migration under authoritarian rule, but they're also all countries that experienced a transition to democracy during the so-called third wave, which was roughly between 1980 and 2000. And then finally, they all are cases of significant diaspora outreach by homeland authorities. So those are the things that they have in common. And then where they differ, the sort of key axis along which they differ, although it's not the only one, is remarkably different levels of turnout in elections from abroad. So I sort of use this as the differentiator for teasing out the similarities and differences across these cases. So in Turkey and the Dominican Republic, you have an above average degree of participation by citizens living abroad who have the right to vote in elections at home. And then in the Philippines and Mexico, you have a below average rate of participation. So what I was interested in looking at is, in part, is how do you explain this, right? Turkey and the Dominican Republic are really, really different. So why do they cluster on the side of above average participation? And likewise, Mexico and the Philippines, maybe not quite as different, but still many, many differences. And yet they cluster on the side of very, very low, I mean, in Mexico's case, like anemic participation in elections from abroad. So that's what I'm trying to explain. And my argument is that really understanding it requires an understanding of this interaction between diaspora making and migrant engagement. So this chart kind of is schematically lays out how things line up. And I have not included migrant profiles in here. I have a whole chapter on that. This really focuses on the political pieces of that feedback loop. And what you can see across the 4 cases, first of all, on the bottom row shows the variation in overseas turnout or turnout from abroad. The average in a sample of over 100 elections that I looked at for another project doing a quantitative analysis of drivers of turnout was about 6%. So it's very, very low. Turnout is really low for lots of reasons by those who are living abroad. So it's relative to the 6% that I'm looking at this variation in the 4 cases. Turkey, the turnout is above 20%. So more than 20% of, the data are problematic, but roughly speaking, over 20% of all Turkish citizens living abroad participate in elections at home. Dominican Republic is high, but less high. It's over 10% on average. Philippines is under 5%, and Mexico is fewer than 1% of all Mexican citizens living abroad participate in elections from abroad. So you have a really clear differentiator across this indicator. And it kind of lines up by the paired cases, right? The key differentiator is Turkey and Dominican Republic both have very transnationalized parties. Not surprisingly, the objectives of diaspora making are heavily electoral. Turkey has also tried to cultivate Turkish nationalists as a foreign policy lobby, particularly when Erdogan was interested in joining the European Union, but it's predominantly electoral. Whereas for Philippines and Mexico, the homeland authorities are predominantly interested in attracting economic resources, remittances, and investment. Mexico also tried to cultivate a Mexico lobby in the United States, particularly when they were trying to get NAFTA passed, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Didn't work very well, but there was an effort to transform the Mexican diaspora into a foreign policy lobby. But predominantly electoral incentives, Turkey and Dominican Republic, economic incentives for Philippines and Mexico, and it's very much linked to what happened to parties and whether they transnationalized and to what degree. And then you also see a variation across the types of loyalty, the predominant types of loyalty cultivation. The Turkish leadership, particularly under Erdogan, very much highlighting sort of appeals to exclusionary nationalism. Who belongs, who's in, who's out, and the stakes being extremely high in their discourse because of this competition with the other, as Erdogan was constructing it. For the Dominican Republic, it's very different. It's targeted side payments. Basically, it's a sort of transnational clientelism that emerges in the Dominican Republic. For the Philippines, it's much more diffuse side payments, particularly to overseas Filipino workers who are on formal contracts that are partly managed by the Philippines government with foreign governments. And they have a huge, well-developed infrastructure for matching workers with employers, for providing social welfare benefits. It's an enormous infrastructure, which I am characterizing as a kind of form of diffuse side payments. And then Mexico has a little bit of side payments, but it's mostly sort of this appeal to an inclusionary nationalism, as you are part of Mexico. Mexican politicians, until the current president would often make these kinds of arguments that you are part of Mexico, my constituents extend beyond Mexican borders, this sort of thing. And we want to include you in the national project of development and democracy. I don't think I have time to go into a lot of detail on the cases. Ellen, how much more time do I have?
We're doing okay. You probably could go another 8 minutes. We only have, I feel, one question in the queue.
Okay.
Go
All right.
another
Well, let
10.
me let me whip through the cases, and I'll just highlight some things that I think are particularly important. And anyone's interested in the presentation, I'm happy to share it, or you can read the book. um,
And the book's in the collection. It's an electronic copy, so we can all read it.
yeah, yeah. So let me just talk a little bit about each of the four cases, and I'll try to keep it relatively brief. I mean, it's one of the things that was really challenging but fun about writing this book is I really try to get into the cases deeply, and sort of trace these feedback loops and dynamics in each of the cases, and then link them to the outcomes in terms of the nature of migrant engagement. So it's a very kind of historically grounded analysis that I do in each of the cases. So one of the things that I mentioned about Turkey is you have these highly transnationalized parties. And essentially what happened in the 1970s and 1980s, where Turkey had two military coups, and the Turkish politics and society became extremely divided and confrontational. And particularly after the coups, significant numbers of Turkish nationals left the country and went mostly to Europe. They were following migrants who left in the 60s as part of guest worker programs with the European countries. So initially migration from Turkey was economically driven, but that transformed in the 1970s and 1980s to a much more political emigration. And parties basically took, many of the party militants and leaders fled to Europe in particular, and sort of recreated their party activities abroad, maintaining close ties with their fellow militants in Turkey. So you have this export of Turkish politics to Europe, especially Germany, but throughout particularly Central and Central North Europe, eventually extends to include France and the UK in particular. And then you have a counter response by the Turkish state, right? Where the Turkish state then starts to reach out and create institutions abroad. And Diyanet was the most significant, which is sort of the institution that manages Turkey's unusual version of secularism. And it created offices, it started religious education programs. So there was a direct response by the Turkish regime to this transnationalization of parties, even during the military regime, which continued after there was a transition to more democratic politics. After democratization, party outreach deepened because now there were competition for votes. Initially, more indirect influence, trying to convince those abroad to talk to their family members who would then vote for the parties. And then eventually, Turkey adopted overseas voting or extraterritorial voting, and then it was direct competition for votes. So you have these very transnationalized parties competing for votes. So not surprisingly, those in government use the state to reinforce those electoral mobilization. So state outreach goes from being more economic to attract remittances and investment to becoming very, very political, to try to extend their constituencies abroad and incorporate those groups into their competition for authority through electoral mechanisms. And then related to this, the sort of loyalty cultivation, there was some strategic loyalty cultivation through distribution of electoral candidacies, advisory board seats, special investment deals for particular members of the Turkish diaspora. But it was mostly these effective appeals to exclusionary nationalism, and especially in the context of the conflict with the Kurds, Kurdish parties, and Kurdish nationalists. And that conflict is reproduced abroad. And so it sort of further kind of mobilizes both sides to be involved in politics back home. So that the Turkish story is really a very rich story of this feedback loop of mobilization and engagement. But it's extremely confrontational and conflictual, both at home and abroad. The Dominican Republic, as I suggested, is quite different, and I kind of call it competitive clientelism abroad. Like in Turkey, you have an export of Dominican parties in the 60s and 70s under authoritarian rule. The main leaders and activists flee the country, mostly to New York. They recreate their party organizing and even infrastructure in New York. And then after the Dominican Republic democratizes, they maintain those ties and those offices and strategies of mobilization that were established during the authoritarian period. A key difference, though, is the state doesn't respond. The authoritarian state just basically ignores them. And I explain why in the book. I don't really have time to explain it. So there's no counter response by the authoritarian state. So what happens when there's democratization is the same parties who are in the opposition come back, become the dominant parties, and then are competing for power in both places. But you still get this sort of mobilizing dynamic. The difference is that the state is captured by parties, which is not really true in the Turkish case. And the state is basically a transmission belt for party patronage and party clientelism. And so loyalty cultivation is predominantly strategic, right? Targeted distribution of electoral candidacies, government posts, advisory board seats. And so the homeland authorities in the Dominican Republic cultivate these rather strong strategic loyalties abroad that help to mobilize the vote, but also sort of link a lot of Dominican mobilizing and organizing abroad, sort of channeling it through in partisan ways, very differently from some of the other cases. And then quickly turning to the Philippines and Mexico. In the Philippines, also very complicated, really interesting, complicated story. But the Philippines also had an authoritarian episode under Ferdinand Marcos between 1972 and 1986. And rather than parties leaving and going abroad, they basically collapsed. They were never particularly strong in the Philippines. And there were a lot of exiles, but they didn't take their party organization or ideologies with them. So you have essentially an elimination of parties, a collapse of parties. At the same time, Marcos decides that the way out of a severe economic crisis in the 1970s is to export Philippine labor. And so it starts this now vast infrastructure of labor exports, which is essentially their development strategy, controlled by the state. So parties are peripheral. The state is central to this project. It's an economic project, and it becomes a kind of depoliticizing project on the part of the state. Because to politicize immigrants is likely not to be something that they can control. And so you get emphasis on remittances and development financing, a careful management. They do grant overseas voting rights after a lot of lobbying and pressure by the diaspora, but they carefully try to control it so that it doesn't get out of their reach. And loyalty cultivation is predominantly strategic, this sort of diffuse distribution of benefits, primarily to overseas foreign workers or overseas Filipino workers, which are kind of on a different track and a different sort of immigrant than the Filipinos who left in the 60s and into the 70s for political reasons, most of whom settled in the United States. The United States is a very large Philippine diaspora. It's a very different diaspora than the overseas foreign workers, particularly in the Gulf countries. So there's sort of this bifurcated diaspora making with differential strategies and distribution of benefits. And then finally, in Mexico, parties never had a presence abroad. Mexico was controlled by a hegemonic party at home starting in 1929 until 2000 when they lost the presidency. And you start to see kind of a nascent transnationalization during democratization, where particularly one opposition party reaches out to migrants, but it's quickly shut down by the state. The state responds, controlled by the hegemonic party, and essentially redirects engagement and outreach through state channels, and essentially nips party transnationalization in the bud and occupies that space. very much with economic objectives to attract remittances and investment, a little bit of foreign policy support. And again, like the Philippines, very careful management of overseas voting rights to contain politicization. And loyalty cultivation is also a combination of sort of diffuse distribution of benefits to migrants in general, and then these effective appeals to exclusionary nationalism. And what I argue is that these different diaspora-making projects in turn reinforce or undermine certain ways for migrants to engage in politics back home. But I don't want to take agency away from the migrants. So this is where I will close on this slide. I recognize and I talk about how diaspora engagement, first of all, goes way beyond voting. And second of all, isn't always adequately controlled by homeland authorities, right? Diasporas don't always cooperate. And you see this most clearly in the Turkish and Philippine cases, which is interesting because they're from different pairs, right? So the Turkish diaspora is very divided. There's a tremendously strong opposition under both types of regimes, right? In Turkey, there's been a very mobilized opposition in the diaspora. And in the Philippines, similarly, they're particularly overseas foreign workers are really well organized. They're very political. They've been able to construct alliances with NGOs and other civil society organizations in the Philippines. They've actually had an impact on transitions, regime transitions. So the government's attempt to depoliticize this relationship has not really worked, but they've managed to marginalize and contain that opposition sort of at the peripheries of the political system. Another thing I talk about in the conclusion, and I don't really have time to go into details, I'm happy to answer questions. One thing that's really interesting is all four of these countries have experienced what could be characterized as regime crises in recent years, in the past 10, 15 years, with implications for state diaspora relations. And I list kind of, I don't know, a hint at what has been going on, but there's been kind of what looks like possibly a reconfiguration of state migrant relations in a couple of these countries, and in Turkey and the Philippines, in a way going back to previous periods in terms of what state diaspora relations look like. And then I'll end by saying, you know, I think diasporas have an ambiguous role in building democracy. Often they reinforce and reproduce dysfunctional patterns of government, and maybe the Dominican case is kind of the clearest example of this. But they can also push back against corrupt and authoritarian rule. And I think you see instances of that in all four cases, where those living abroad organize protests, lobby and collaborate with other actors to demand policy change or to demand regime change. And so where they fall really depends on the nature of their relationship with their homeland, the nature of the diaspora itself, and other sort of contextual factors. So I will close there, and I look forward to questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.